Hello World! Or indeed, Hello World printed on matrix printer paper, handwritten by Brian Cunningham, the one person who came up with these 2 lines of C code in 1978. This is the original item where it all started, and every programmer after 1978's introduction to computer programming. This was sold on the very first auction of computer algorithms back in 2017. But you did not only get the original piece of paper, you also got exclusive access to a GitHub repository with the original Hello World source code in it, with a license applying to it as well, as you do with source code. But this sold for $8,000. A fairly low price for a very big relic of computer history. And by that, we start our journey into the history of computer art. And it's going to be a hayride from the 1950s up until this very day with loads of interesting cultural experiences. So welcome along, everyone. This is a story, as it always is, that starts in the United States of America with this guy. This is Michael Null. He's a pivotal figure within the world of computer art, but most interestingly, he was an engineer, a software engineer working at Bell Laboratories in the late 50s, early 60s, and what he was working on was speech recognition, which seems fairly contemporary, but he was doing this many moons ago. He had this wonderful computer. This is the IBM 1790 computer, which was the second generation of IBM vacuum tube computers that he could play around with. So he spent some time along with his colleagues in the laboratories at night experimenting with this expensive piece of hardware. Back then it cost $3 million. That would be around $18 million today. But he used this to do artistic experiments.
Not too well. We're still having trouble with F-drive in regard to density changing on the 1401.
And say, well, we'll put it on the 7090 then and use it for an output tape.
Yeah, that should cool it. You play it that way.
Yeah, no sweat. Okay, anything else?
Yeah, I'm glad I thought of it. Well, I had it logged. You'll notice that when you come up on Balgol and where the compiler has a beautiful bug in it, in case we get clobbered.
So the compiler has a beautiful bug. This is the actual computer and what it looks like. This was the equipment they were working on, and the project he was working on suddenly had a bug in the compiler. And what do you do when you come across a bug? You write a memo. This is what was the form of emails you had back in the 1960s. So Michael Null distributed this thing about computer-generated patterns. And the actual source code, the Fortran source code for the program looked like this. It was supposed to produce something scientifical. It produced this mumble of lines instead. And he showed this to his colleagues at Bell Labs, and his colleague Evelyn Bergkamp said that, you know what, Michael, what you have created here is computer art, and hence the term was there. She coined the word. But she was not really the first person to do this. There was a Brit, Desmond Paul Henry. And Desmond Paul Henry was collecting computers used during the Second World War. He had a collection of Norden bomb sights. These were the bomb sights that were fitted in the Allied forces' bomb airplanes that were used to aim at targets. Now, these were analog computers that had different inputs for altitude, airspeed, wind direction, and so forth. And based on that, they tried to calculate the exact right time to drop the bombs on. And he modified these machines to become drawing machines, creating beautiful fractal art. This is fractal geometry in the sense that it is repetition. There are these parabolas that it's drawing again and again and again through an iterative process, as you would do with fractals, for those of you who are familiar with those. And he created tons upon tons of these patterns. And this was done, and he exhibited this a few months before the people at Bell Labs coined the term computer art. He had his first exhibition. So this was the very, very first time this was shown to the public in the UK. And if you go to the Wikipedia article on computer art, they tell you that this was invented by Michael Null. It was not. It was Desmond Paul Henry. So go on, it's a race between all of you to get to the Wikipedia page and add that piece of vital information. Ready, set, go. But let's get back to Bell Laboratories and some of the works they actually did there. This is something that Michael Null did, and a work by a very much more famous artist called Pierre Mondrian. The Mondrian piece is from 1917, and it's called Composition with Lines. It's a historic moment in art's history because this is the first neoplastic work that Mondrian did when he diverged from being more of a figurative painter and going fully abstract on. So this is the very beginning of the Mondrian works you might have seen with the lines with these bright colored blocks between them. This is where it all started. And this was a great inspiration to Michael Null when he, in 1965, created his computer composition with lines, which is the other painting that we are looking at here. And this motif was not chosen on random because Michael Null found this to be a very interesting challenge for him as a computer programmer to try to recreate an iconic artwork. And he had these two printouts with him and went around to his colleagues and showed them to them. And he asked the one question, which one do you prefer? And I'll ask you that very same question, which one do you prefer? Now point to the picture that you like the most. You're a very mixed crowd, and I appreciate that. And that's one of the important things about art. It's very much about our personal experiences and what we see in those works. So that was one example of very early works coming out of the Bell Laboratories environment. This is another one. Or there are two paintings. The one that has colors on it is a very classic one by Paul Klee, German artist. It's called High Roads and By Roads. It's from 1929. It's a very, very iconic work from his Bauhaus period. And he was obsessed with perspectives and how to use colors to emphasize things in his paintings and so forth. This very much inspired the mathematician Frida Nake, who made the other painting, which is called Hommage à Paul Klee numéro 2. It was also made in 1965, and he tries to recreate what he saw in the Paul Klee painting with his computer. So this plot, or drawing as it might be, is created by tracing the lines across. And this is very much in the spirit of Paul Klee, because when Paul Klee was painting his paintings, he said that he walked the lines across the canvas. And in the same sense, Frida Nake walked the lines using a plotter that drew the lines by walking across the paper. So he did that first, and then he filled in the spaces in between, so the negative space, with random geometric forms, be it lines, circles, and so forth, trying to recreate what he saw. So all of these works of imitation, but interesting things were happening in Europe at the same time. This is the French artist Manfred Moore, and he was a classically trained painter who discovered computer science in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and had his first exhibition at the Musée de Modern Art in Paris, 1971, where he showed some of the works that he had been creating using computers. Now, this is one example of that, and here is another. The first one you saw is a work entitled Quark Lines, or Program Number 52. It was created in 1970, and it has much in common with the Frida Nake work that we just saw. It's algorithmically generated in the sense that the program chooses anywhere between 12 and 35 points horizontally across the line. then draws a line connecting those points, and then progresses the pattern for 40 lines, and then makes a gap, and then repeats in an iterative process to fill the entire canvas. And from that simple algorithm, you get this very interesting pattern of something that resembles brush strokes moving across from one hand to the other, bounded by this box. The other work from the very same exhibition is very much different. And it's a work called Pour Pierre Barbon. And Pierre Barbon was a French composer who had made a name for himself during the 1960s in being one of the first people ever to use computers to compose music. So he composed classical music by using computers. Here is Barbon in his writing room, and it's not your average setup for composing music. But he inspired Manfred Moore very much to create these images, but he also inspired another artist that would be very important to the maturity of computer art during this period.
J'ai donc mis dans ma petite tête que je vais essayer de faire de l'art visuel à l'ordinateur. Aujourd'hui, c'est vite dit, mais un premier essai qui ne marchait pas du tout, c'était grâce à Pierre Barbon, mais je me suis entêté quand même, et c'était en 68, où tout était possible, on pouvait tout dire, tout penser, tout rêver, tout. J'ai entendu dire qu'il y a l'Université de Paris 1 a un centre de calcul. Mon mari était au CNRS, il avait même possibilité d'y travailler, mais c'était très compliqué puis très cher. On le vendait le temps de calcul en les secondes. Un laboratoire pouvait avoir 10 secondes, par exemple, par semaine. Mais j'ai pris mon courage entre mes deux mains, j'ai frappé à la porte du directeur du centre de calcul et je lui ai dit que, bonjour monsieur, j'aimerais essayer de faire de l'art visuel sur ordinateur. Écoute, le gars qui m'a jeté un coup d'œil, je ne peux pas te dire, il avait peur que je vais tomber dingue et qu'il faut faire venir une infirmière, vite, ou... Enfin, art visuel, oui. Il a dit oui. Il a dit oui.
He said yes. So this is Vera Molnar from a very recent interview. She was a much younger woman back in the late 1960s when she discovered informatics and the possibility of programming computers to make art. And she also was very much inspired by Paul Klee. This is one of her most iconic works. It's called À la recherche de Paul Klee, or In Search for Paul Klee, also from 1970. It's more or less the same motif as Frida Naki was working with, but she has an entirely different approach to this. This is a work in a series of studies based on Paul Klee's work done by Vera Molnar. And she decomposes the canvases of Paul Klee into these little squares of different line patterns. And compared to Frida Naki's imitation of Paul Klee's work, trying to recreate something similar, she does a full-on reinterpretation of the work, and in that sense, bringing something more interesting and something of more artistic merit and value to this. And that was one of her most important contributions to developing computer art into something different. These are two earlier works from Vera Molnar. These are called Interruptions, and they are from a big series of very mathematical works. So she does the same things as many of the men who were pioneers within the world of computer art, using mathematical patterns to just plot rotating lines across the canvas. But she does something genius. And she adds a whole lot by taking things away, by taking bits and pieces out and making these stops and interruptions in between the lines. We get a very much more evocative expression here. And this might be the time in computer art history where things stop being interesting mathematical computer science experiments and resembling something that has that emotional evocation that makes something art. Some very, very modal abstract jazz music for you. This is a work by Stan van der Beek. It's called Poem Field No. 2, 1966, and it has a jazz soundtrack by Paul Motian. This was also something coming out of the Bell Laboratories. There was a programmer at the Bell Laboratories called Kenneth Nolte, who had been in secret developing a programming language called Bellflix to create animation films for the military. And the reason for making that was to create an animation of what happens at ground zero when an atomic bomb explodes. This was a secret project, though, but they managed to use the technology to create this. And this is a programming language intended for creating bitmap images, and then you print it onto celluloid film. So combining those two, you get this very, very lo-fi, sort of interesting expression that goes really well with the weird jazz music in the background, and making that pioneering step into motion becoming a part of computer art as well. So a very interesting work from the late 60s there. This is obviously a bit more contemporary, but not as contemporary as you might think. These are works by Harold Cohen, and it's from his lifelong project called Aaron. Now, Harold Cohen was a classically trained painter who had been part of the 1966 Venice Biennale, representing Great Britain there, as a painter. But a few years later, he got a professorate at the University of California and was introduced to the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at Stanford University that year. And this sparked a keen interest in programming with him. So he set out to create this project that he called Aaron, which would be the first ever artificial intelligence to create paintings. And some of the works that Aaron could do would look something like this. This is from one of the first exhibitions ever of works painted by Aaron in concert with Harold Cohen. So Aaron at this time, this was 1978, was only capable of doing black and white line drawings. So these are hand-colored by Cohen himself. It's from a series of works called the Amsterdam Suite, and it was exhibited at the Zezy Museum in Amsterdam in the late 70s. But you already here, you get these interesting, abstract, sort of organic forms created by the computer. And he would keep on evolving this project. And it's not an AI in the sense that we would know it today from something like Midjourney or Dolly. It has a much more procedural approach, but it's not programmed to draw anything specific. It makes its own choices along the way. It only knows how to do things like draw faces, the different features of a face, and then work from then and out. And come the 1980s, and this AI had developed quite a lot. This is a work from 1988, which is at the very breaking point where Aaron started drawing the faces that we saw in the beginning here and having its big breakthrough. At this time, the keen interest was in combining the foreground and the background. Now, Aaron always starts painting the foreground first and then adding the background elements. But this is very much has a striking likeness to Paul Cézanne's paintings of bathers from a century before, in the sense that you have a similarity in color of the people in front and the foliage in the background. So a very interesting work there that he kept on building and building upon all the way up to until a few years back when he sadly passed. So for those of you who have seen my talk on computer music, you know that I have a love for Brian Eno. But Brian Eno is not only a musician, he's a visual artist as well, and this is a very interesting work by Brian Eno called 77 Million Paintings from 2007. Brian Eno broke through as an ambient music artist when he created the work Music for Airports. This would probably be music for galleries. It's self-generating works of art based on hundreds of different paintings that Brian Eno has made himself, and then it's an algorithm he has crafted that puts these bits and pieces together to the artworks you see. Now, the title 77 million paintings is approximately the number of paintings you would manage to look at in your entire lifetime, from the age you discover and develop an interest in art, looking at paintings 8 hours a day, a new one every 10 minutes for your entire lifetime. And that sort of adds this grandness to these fairly simple motifs that are part of Brian Eno's work, but a very interesting one. You could own this as a screensaver, or it could be distributed as a DVD as well, but best experience in the gallery rooms, as this would be as well. This is a work by the artist Quering Archangel, and it's entitled Super Mario Clouds. Quering Archangel is one of the pioneers in modern, more conceptual directions of digital art. And Quering Archangel created this work that is usually exhibited by projections on the walls as well as CRT screens, as you see here, with the work being displayed on. The work itself is this. It's a modified Super Mario Brothers cartridge for the Nintendo Entertainment System, where Quering Archangel, who is not only a very good artist in the sense that he has great ideas and works in very many different mediums, is a very good programmer as well. So he has gone in and modified the actual game to take away all the elements except for the skies and the clouds, which gives this serene movement of calmness to the rather hectic game that Super Mario Brothers is known to be. But there is also something interesting going on here. I would connect this and liken this to the works of the Romantic era and the Romantic periods of art, where artists were very much interested in painting lifelike, dramatic landscapes with cloudscapes and waves and everything. Here we have a very dramatic cloudscape in the sense that what you were able to do with computers 1985 when this game was released. So an interesting conceptual work using an iconic game from computer game history. Believe it or not, this is what the web once looked like. This is the website jody.com, created by the Dutch duo of artists Joan Heemskerk and Dirk Parkman. It's a project that started way back in the infancy of the World Wide Web in 1993. And they are exploring the cultures and aesthetics of the internet, and they have been doing this for decades after this one. It's really an interesting commentary on what we have to deal with when we have human-computer interactions and what user experiences mean for your experience of interacting with the computer. So this thing is a terrible user experience, and there were quite a few web pages at the same time doing this. This is a work by Ben Benjamin from 1997 called superbad.com that starts off with a very regular-looking web page at the time, but there are some oddities there. There are banner ads that say, we have run out of ad space at the top of the page. And when you start clicking things, you are led into this strange maze and labyrinth of oddities and experiments in web design. And this goes on forever and ever. It's almost infinite. And you can click around. There is no clear pattern to how you navigate through this maze of web pages. But there is more to it as well. In particular, if you do something that was fairly common back in the 1990s, where everyone was learning how to create web pages, was that you would right-click and choose from the menu View Source to see how this thing was built. And if you do that on these websites, you will find an underworld of sort of secrets and illegal materials that are there. Now, when the World Wide Web became something that was available to large parts of the world, this was a platform for distributing content that would be very naughty to have before. And by this, I think of things like the Anarchist's Handbook, which has things like recipes on how to make a bomb. Go right-click, view source, and you can find those things hidden beneath the surface. You can also find schematics for how to create a nuclear reactor. So there are many layers upon layers in this thing, and it's a very interesting example of how artists started using the web as a medium for communicating. And today we might find this a bit odd, but back in 1995, around 10% of all websites on the entire World Wide Web were experimental websites created by people like these. Word of warning, there is some graphic video game content coming up in the next slide, so if you don't want to see that, look away. This is a work by Joseph DePape called Elegy that ran from July 4th, 2018 until July 4th, 2019. And it ran as a live stream on Twitch. And it was a live stream of a highly modified version of the game Grand Theft Auto 5. Now, Grand Theft Auto is a series of video games that had gotten massive critique for the amount of violence in the game. What Joseph DePape does here is that he has a self-playing game that starts at midnight every day throughout that year with a body count of 0. And then the protagonist in the game goes around and kills the number of people who up until that date, that year, have been killed in gun-related homicides within the United States. So the number steadily increases day by day throughout the year, reflecting gun violence in the US society. All this while Katie Smith's God Bless America plays in the background. And when Joseph DePape created this work, it was 100 years since Irving Berlin had written that very song. So what Joseph DePape does with this video game is that he takes a video game that has gotten massive criticism from American society, then flips it all around and uses that game to comment on the insane amount of gun crimes and murders that are part of that very society that critiqued the game. When we came to New Year's Eve 2018, the counter stopped at 14,730 murders. If it had been allowed to run all the way to New Year's Eve the year after, that number would have been 15,292 killings in that year. And this, sadly, is a number that keeps on rising. This is a very interesting work that was inspired by another major and violent event in American history as well. This is a work by radical software group called Carnivore, and it was created after the 9/11 attacks on the United States. It's very much inspired by a tool that the FBI created and started using in their war on terror after the 9/11 attacks, with the same name, also called Carnivore. That was a tool for digital surveillance on the internet. So that snooped on every email that was sent and between people, and that's exactly what Carnivore does. It's a piece of open source software created by this group of hackers/artists that snoops on network traffic and then visualizes this with these different colored blocks that we have in the background. And if you let this run for a while, you will see elements of traffic that it has captured pop up in this artwork. And it's a very emblematic work showing how much hacker ethics and hacker culture relates to artists' culture as well, because you have some of the same principles driving you. You want to use the tools at your disposal to comment and say something about the society and world you live in, and that is what Radical Software Group does with this one. It has been exhibited in many different forms. It's still available, and it's still steadily being updated. You are all encouraged to go on GitHub and download the source code for this and create your own interpretations of this work by a Radical Software Group and get it running on your computer. Another interesting work that has much to do with computer source code is this. It's a work called biennial.py, and it's done by Eva and Franco Mattis in 2001. Yes, it's a piece of printed Python source code, so tracks back to that hello world thing we saw in the beginning. This is a work that was presented at the 29th Venice Biennale in 2001. And the setup in the gallery space of this was two pedestals set in the middle of the room with two computers opposite of each other, with a computer virus infecting the other computer and then the computer infecting the other one back. And what the actual work is, which was displayed on the back wall of this gallery space, is the actual source code for that computer virus with the artist's annotations on this. Yeah, I know that this might be a bit difficult to read, especially for you people in the back, so I will tell you a few things about the source code itself. It's a very interesting use of naming conventions in here. I doubt that you write code that has any similar naming practices. In here, you will find variables named for things like fornication, chatting, and joining conversations. You have central entities within the program describing themselves as my soul and my body. And these names suggest a blurring between the digital world of the virus and the very much physical world that the computers infecting each other exist in. And you might also think as things like having a body and soul, making the computer virus take on a sort of physical presence within the world, and recognizing that having a viral infection is something that might have an impact on the world around it as well. At this time, 2001, computer viruses were very much a nuisance. But we also have this concept of sexual reproduction being part of how the reproductive act of the virus itself happens. So when the virus replicates, it describes that as a biological sexual replication act, while when it does things with files that will not create a replication of the virus, that is linked to masturbation. So there are interesting things in this source code, and I think that is, it gives me pleasure to sit down and read this source file in a very different way than it would with a regular piece of software. So interesting, and this is also discovered by antiviral software, so if you try to download it, just be advised. This is another interesting piece of source code as well. And it's a work by Yusuke Endo called Clobe. It's written in Ruby, and it was released in 2010. In the same sense that the Python BNL virus was a piece of self-replicating source code, this is as well. But this is something called a Queen, which is a program that outputs its own source code whenever run. But Yusuke Endo goes one step further in the sense that every time you run this code, the globe in the middle rotates by a few degrees, and when you run it again, it keeps on doing that, not changing the behavior of the program itself, because this happens every single time you run this, but changing the actual representation of the program through the source code. And this, of course, shows great talents as a programmer. You have to be a master of the Ruby programming language to be able to pull something like this off. But it also shows that playfulness and the creativity to sit down and think that, you know what, today I am going to write a piece of code that modifies its own source code to display a rotating globe on screen. This is something that feels very modern, but at the same time traces back to some iconic artworks in history, because the concept of self-replication is something that has been there for quite some time. You have probably all seen MC Escher's hands that draw each other. Two hands where one hand draws the other. It's an infinite process of hands drawing hands. And Escher was very much interested in tessellation, fractal repetition problems, and so forth, approaching this as a mathematical problem, and he has been very much an inspiration for all computer programmers venturing into the world of art after him. Another work that would be more contemporary, one that you can go and see in London, is by Anish Kapoor, and it's called The Cloud Gate, which is a big reflective sculpture that reflects light in infinite directions and has that sense of mirrors recursively reflecting light beams for an never-ending piece of work based on the world and the globe itself. So, dancing apes, who can do without them? Yes, we are going to talk about the Boring Ape Yacht Club, which is a non-fungible token art project that was launched in 2021 at the very height of the NFT and crypto wave. It's a set of 10,000 unique artworks that are represented on the Ethereum blockchain. But I do not really find that use of the blockchain and link to cryptocurrency very interesting. I do find it interesting the way this is created, though. First and foremost, these apes look very much like Andy Warhol's pop artworks from the 1960s, where Andy Warhol used the means of graphical mass production to mass produce art, creating the entire phenomenon of pop art. And in the same way, NFTs built on a algorithmic approach to how these things are to be designed is very much the same thing as Andy Warhol did. But it's also interesting that this is something that has been done in arts history before. This is ballet. This is a dance work done by a choreographer called Lucinda Childs. Lucinda Childs made this routine called dance in 1979, and it utilizes simple movements, the basic movements in ballet. These are all glissades and pas de chat moving across stage, but it's all composed by an algorithm, because Lucinda Childs was using the approach that an artist called Sol Lewitt had invented a few years earlier for a conceptual series of works that he called wall paintings. And for all these, there were algorithms. Here we see craftspeople creating the artworks of Sol Lewitt in the studio space. And what Sol Lewitt did was that he separated the idea for the artwork and the approach to create it from the creation itself. So for instance, you would have something like one of the wall drawings that he created in 1976, which has instructions on the wall surface or any continuous stretch of wall. Using a hard pencil, place 50 points at random. The points should be evenly distributed all over the area of the wall, then make possible straight lines connecting the pair points. Very much like the Manfred Moore work we saw earlier. And he also has things like lines not too short, not too long, straight, crossing and touching, drawn at random across the wall, very much like the work that Vera Molnar was doing 10 years earlier. So what Sol Lewitt did was that he wrote instructions, much like computer programs for craftspeople like these, to create the works in the gallery space. And when we are on that topic of non-fungible tokens and cryptocurrencies and all that, there is one very interesting work that was done by Anna Riddler in 2019 called the Mosaic Virus. And it's this work you are looking at currently. These are tulip bulbs evolving. And Anna has created this from a set of 10,000 photos of tulips that she has labeled and created a training set for an AI to recreate these bulbs. And this is all built around the historical financial speculation that happened in Holland during the 17th century called the Dutch tulip mania, which was the time that Holland was beginning to be known for being the best tulip producer in the entire world. And some of these bulbs rose to insane prices because of their rarity and the perceived rarity that people had. So this is most likely one of the first sort of speculative bubbles ever. And Anna Riddler's work, Mosaic Art, creates these bubbles, or these bulbs. But what happens is that you can see them changing a bit, and those changes are determined by the real-time fluctuations of the volatility of the Bitcoin price. So she takes a gallery work built on one of the first speculative bubbles we have and links that in a very clever way to one of the most important speculative bubbles that are today, which is cryptocurrency. Let's look at more flowers. This is a work called The Comparative History of Animated GIFs and Glitter Graphics from 2007 by Ulia Lialina. It is exhibited in the gallery space as a stack of CRT screens showing side by side a GIF from the early days of the Web 0.10 period with the glitter graphics that were popular towards the end of that very period. And this is an interesting work in that it really comments on a big transition that happened around the time it was created, 2007, because this was when the period where we had the amateur web, where everyone had their own web page, and And the internet was a very creative space where things started moving over to capitalist, corporate-controlled platforms such as Facebook and the social medias, forever changing that aesthetic that was seen online. You would no longer have these things with animated GIFs, glitter graphics, and so forth. You would have this meticulously designed websites were done by corporations who had the means and money to employ professional designers. And in a sense, you would end up killing off the web rings sort of. Who has seen a Metallica fan ring lately on the web? Probably no one. That were part of the Web 0.10 period. So it's more a lament to a bygone time at the time this is changing. This was where this story ended the first time I started talking about the history of computer art back in 2018. This is a work done by a collective from Paris, and it's called Portrait of Edmund Bellamy. This is a AI-generated portrait, and it's generated by a competitive adversarial network, and it's signed by the actual algorithm for that. This was auctioned away at an auction at Christie's, October 23rd, 2018. It was estimated to catch somewhere in the range of $7,000 to $10,000 US. It ended up selling for $432,000. So the most expensive computer-generated and AI-generated work ever sold. And this was sort of at the peak of a hype curve, which is why this happened. Now, this isn't your regular, everyday dolly photo. It is way more low fidelity, but it also has a backstory to this. Edmund Bellamy has a family tree and a lineage that goes way back that sort of complements the work itself, but it's one of those examples of a work that gets a lot of attention for it being something novel. German artist Mario Klingemann tried to do something similar the year after with this work. It's a work called Memories of a Passerby #1. It's a work where you have two AI-generated portraits being displayed side by side, generated in real time. There's a computer inside this cabinet that creates these images. It's also made in the same way by training an AI on a ton of classical portraits and then using those to generate new portraits based on that. Only being sold a year after this was a real disappointment when it was sold on auction and didn't fetch anything near those amounts that the portrait of Edmund Bellamy was sold for the year before. And no one has ever seen the portrait of Edmund Bellamy after it's in private ownership, has never been displayed at the gallery, and it's probably not that interesting a work either. Because today, these kinds of artworks are everywhere. I think this is a very interesting use of this technology. It's a work by Norwegian artist Toril Johannessen, and it's called Representation for the People and Those Representing Them. And it was unveiled fall last year. It's displayed at City Hall in Bergen. And it is a set of tapestries that is created from 900 AI-generated faces that is generated from a training set of 900 real live people from Bergen. So this is meant as a memento to the politicians elected by the people to remember who they are there for. And it's a very interesting and provocative work, I would say.
AI systems often inherit the bias of the cis-white heteronormative patriarchy that controls our society. But here at the Zezy Show, we plan to disrupt the data set by flooding it with a myriad of marvelous queer drag bodies. So without further ado, that's French, sit back, relax, get your clicking fingers at the ready as we begin the Zezy Show!
The Zezy Show, the first ever AI-generated drag show ever done by Jake Evans. It's not this one I want to talk about. I want to talk about the work that led to him creating this one. But this is an interesting work of performance art. I want to look at this instead. This is a work done by the same artist, and it's from 2019, and it's called Quering the Data Set. Interesting play on words there. Usually we are querying the data set, and what Jake is doing here is that he has taken one of the most widely used training data sets for facial recognition AIs, which is trained on a very conformative cis heteronormative data set, and then introduced 1 or 10% of changed 10% of those with different drag queens, drag kings, and drag things into that data set. And with that little change, we get this entirely different representation of people, and it's a comment on the lack of representation of the queer community within the data sets that surrounds us. And the idea of the Zezy Show is a play on the concept of having a Z chromosome in addition to the X and Y chromosome that represents people of non-binary identities. So I think this is a very interesting and provocative work that says something about the technologies it uses to create this as well. We need to keep in mind that not everyone is alike to ourselves when we work with computers and IT, and this is a good reminder of that. Yes, the big question. I put myself sort of out on a ledge with trying to answer one of the big questions of life during this talk, and I'm sort of I realized I wasn't lowering the bar with that introduction to this piece. So here we go. I want to do this by showing you some artworks. This is obviously not an artwork. You can all see that this is part of that which has been known as platform realism, which is the art period we are in now with AI-generated works. But this is something I created when I asked ChatGPT to describe to me this other work, which is a very iconic postmodernist work, and then just use Dolly to create that photo again. And we are going to be talking about what we are actually looking at. So the photo here is a work by Jeff Wall from 1992. It's called Mimic. And it's one of the, as I said, one of the most iconic postmodernist works there are. What we see is we see 3 people walking down a suburban environment, 70s period, and we see that the man holding his girlfriend's hand is about to overtake an Asian man in front of them, and he sort of has this slanted look, holding his finger up, with a vibe of racism under there. The girlfriend appears to be a bit disgusted, looks away, while the Asian man is sort of observing this in the corner of his eye. If we look into the center of the photo, where we are usually having our attention looking at photos, we realize that smack down in the middle there is this divide between 2 people, representing the racial divide that was present in the West at that time. And we also see them surrounded by these industrial buildings at the sides around this. If we also look carefully at the poses of these people, we can see that their legs are perfect reflections of each other, so they are mirroring all the way through, raising the question, which is the title of this photo: who is mimicking who? Well, one thing is for sure is that Jeff Wall was mimicking Gustave Caillebot's Paris Street Rainy Day from a century before. And this is something that is very much a trait with Jeff Wall's art, is that every painting or every photo he creates is based on a work from previous art history. So you will always in his works find references to something different. So that's in there. And that, if you look at the surroundings, the Paris streets of the Haussmann era, very optimistic period in Paris, where people were looking at the bright future, juxtaposed with this place, which is a sort of industrial suburban area where weeds grow and dreams come to die. And in that sense, Jeff Wall is asking the questions of why are we treating the immigrants who helped build this world so badly when we get to enjoy everything that they have contributed with to our community. So there is so much going on here beneath the surface that Dolly did not catch at all when creating this photo. It just saw what it could see visually. And that's the thing that differentiates what art is from what is just an illustration. Art is there for us to get an emotional response. It's always there to try to tell us something about the world we live in and make us discover interesting things. So next time you look at a piece of art in a gallery, start asking those questions about what am I really looking at here? What lies beneath it? But you do not need to know all those details I just told you to enjoy this photo, because it's a very striking image, and that brings the art of, or the language of cinema to the world of photography, which is what Jeff Wall is known for doing. So with this, or these two creations, you have the tools at ready to go out and create art. You can definitely use things like Midjourney, Dolly, and so forth to create art. It's more about the ideas that you have for what you want to create than tools that you use to create it. And there is no reason to not do this, but remember, please just promise me one thing. If you do go out and do this, keep that human touch in there. Because like Vera, who we met earlier, at the age of 99, did every single day, even if she was using computers to draw these line-based drawings, every evening she sat down and drew a line by hand. And she lived to be 100 years old. So please go home, do that, draw something by hand, a line or anything. Go ahead and create the art you want to. This has been a brief history of computer art. I'm Anders Norås. Hope you have a great rest of the NDC, and thank you all for coming.